Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the nation's 2 crime measures, hosted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kimberly Martin, statistician with the Law Enforcement Incidence-Based Statistics Unit with BJS, to begin the presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the nation's 2 crime measures. The agenda today is I'd like to introduce myself and also my fellow panelists. My name is Kimberly Martin. I work for BJS as a statistician. I am in the Law Enforcement Incident-Based Statistics Unit, where a lot of our work primarily revolves around NIBRS, both assisting the transition and also working with the data in several ways that we'll talk about today. And then with me presenting on the National Crime Victimization Survey are my colleagues at BJS, 2 statisticians, Alexandra Thompson, who goes by Lexi, I think, and Susanna Tapp. Both will be presenting on sort of towards the latter half of the talk when we talk about the NCVS and ways that you can use the data. And then, as Daryl mentioned earlier, we have some polling examples, a mini pop quiz of sorts, but fun, I promise, where we talk about what data source might be best given a particular crime question that you have. So one of the things we want to do is first give a primer on NIBRS, talk about some of the findings that you can produce from NIBRS. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is informed by a lot of the questions we get about NIBRS. It is relatively new for some researchers who did not begin using it until the nation's transition recently. And so we're going to go over some of the nuts and bolts of NIBRS today. Same for NCVS. And so what I wanted to first talk about before we dive into those is kind of why are we here? The 2, these are the nation's 2 measures of crime. They complement each other. They are different in some ways. They're not competing data collections, they're complementary data collections. I often tell people that I think of them as sort of a Venn diagram, a holistic approach to measuring and understanding crime statistics. Both data collections, they're vastly different in some ways. And that's one of the reasons why we're giving this talk today, is to talk about those differences, both in the types of crimes they measure, the way both data collections are fielded, and the types of data collected. One is survey, one is administrative data. But there's also some important similarities where we can leverage these 2 data collections and, when together they form sort of a more complete picture of crime. People sometimes want to sort of reconcile differences, either in patterns or levels of crime that they might see between the 2. And that can lead to confusion, either about each individual data collection and what it measures, or about the validity maybe of one data collection versus another when crime estimates might diverge and people want to reconcile why. That's why we're here today. And one of the things we want to talk about is you may have seen a publication like the one that you see on the screen. This was put out last fall, and it is a brief summary of the findings, for annual 2022 data from NIBRS, which we produced national estimates of crime based on in 2022, and then also the NCVS. And what's remarkable is that as different as the 2 data collections are, you're going to see in these, in the table in front of you, some of these estimates are actually quite close. Some of them are not. And the key thing we want to help users understand is, 1, this data is freely available. It's richer than a lot of people realize. And so we're here to sort of promote resources and to promote use of the data, responsible use of the data. But another thing that we want to do is help people understand why sometimes a certain data collection is more suited for a particular question than another one, and why there are valid reasons why estimates might look different across the 2 data collections. And it's important to understand some that might be driven by methodological differences versus maybe something else, something exogenous to the actual data collection experience and the process. And if you understand both data collections and what they can measure, we sort of, get a little further towards our understanding of how they complement each other. And so what we want you to get out of this webinar today is to kind of go beyond that publication that I just showed you. And this is something we, have put out 2 years in a row now, where we show national indicators of crime across the 2 data collections. We want to go beyond what's in that quick report, not just present what the findings look like for crime across the 2 data collections, but understand why there may be slight differences, like what you saw in that initial slide, But we also want to talk to people about how to access the data, view it, analyze it, and be able to really leverage these data collections, which are freely available, to answer their own questions, either as part of their research or as part of what they do in their own jurisdiction if they're in law enforcement. And so that's really what we're going to talk about today, is the nuts and bolts of these data collections and how we want to help promote increased use of them. And we want to talk about access to resources that can help you. So the first section of the talk, we're going to talk about NIBRS, which stands for the National Incident-Based Reporting System. This measure of the nation's crime consists of reports of crime from law enforcement agencies across the U.S. So already you can see that there's a distinct difference between NIBRS and what it collects and NCVS. My colleagues, Lexi and Susanna, will talk about the NCVS and how it's a household survey. But as you can see, these records come from law enforcement agencies, and it's the FBI that administers NIBRS and develops the NIBRS technical specification. And so I just want to give, just to kind of provide some context for how we got to where we are. This SRS, the old summary reporting system that existed before NIBRS, many of you might be familiar with it. They counted the number of crimes, and it's typically about 8 offenses, not much delineation, within those broad categories of offenses. That started in the 1920s. It was implemented around 1929, 1930, where the FBI began collecting it, administering it, and storing it, and publishing it. And then in 1989, all the way back to 1989, there was a recognized need for more detailed data where we could have greater specificity of offenses and then actually learn more about the parties involved in those incidents and some of the important characteristics of those incidents, such as time of day, location, weapon usage. That dates all the way back to 1989. So fast forward to 2021, and now NIBRS is the nation's official source of crimes known to law enforcement and reported by law enforcement. The FBI sunset the summary reporting system back it was sunset as of January 1st, 2021. And so it's taken quite a bit of time to get here. And a lot of questions that, people ask are, why now? Why transition the nation now? And the reason they ask that is because it has been a process. This transition, and I'll talk about it in just a few minutes, has been piecemeal over time, but there was a good reason for it. Rather than just counting 10 broad offenses with NIBRS, we know, we can do basically a lot more. We don't have a hierarchy rule where we only count one offense. But the key thing we needed was to understand the nature of crime, not just the volume of it. And that's what NIBRS has helped us accomplish. And so what I want to do is kind of give you a snapshot. Speaking of piecemeal, we are now, as of 2023, the FBI sunset NIBRS as of January 1st, 2021. As of 2023, which is the next year of NIBRS data that will be released later this fall by the FBI. And nationally, we have about 78.6% of all law enforcement agencies are participating. And those consist of local police departments, sheriff's departments, tribal agencies, campus and university police departments, special agencies, and state law enforcement, and also some federal law enforcement. So we have gone from a participation rate of, in the 30s just several years ago when we started a program to start transitioning agencies. That was around 2015, to now 78% agencies participating in the US. So that's a big jump for 2023. And what that jump in agency participation got us is, for the first time, once the 2023 NIBRS data are released later this year, it will cover 84% of the US population. So that is our first time getting over 80%. And a lot of people, we see that as sort of a critical mark in our advancement towards going strictly to incident-based reporting. So that is what the coverage of NIBRS looks like. And it has taken many years to get there. Now, I want to just talk briefly about the structure of NIBRS. A lot of the questions about NIBRS that we get at BJS have to do with analyzing the data and statistical uses of the data so that people can answer questions about their community or understand what's going on in their jurisdiction from the data. So I want to talk a little bit about the data structure because it has implications for how you count crime using NIBRS. So there are 8 segments, and the ones I want to just highlight for folks right here, I'm sorry, there's 7 segments. The ones I want to highlight here are the ones people are going to use the most, which is arrestee segments, offender segments, victim segment, and then on this next slide, you will see property, offense, and administrative segments. They are all individual. They are not connected. That means with NIBRS, you have lots of flexibility. You can analyze crime at the offense level. You can analyze crime at the offender level if you want to better understand what percentage of offenders meet this criteria or commit these crimes or are armed, for example. If you want to understand victimization, you would use the victim segment. And the reason I bring this up is because we're going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about a resource that BJS has developed and sort of enhanced in recent years called the NIBRS extract files, where we take these segments and we concatenate them into a data structure that combines all of these segments together so that you can answer a research question without having to go to each segment. And so the thing about NIBRS, it appears complex, and it can be, but it offers unmatched flexibility. If you want to understand crime at the incident level, you can do that as well. So let's talk about what NIBRS captures. And this represents one of the biggest differences, I think, with the NCVS. And one of the reasons why you may see crime, measures of crime that might differ across the 2 data collections, NCVS and NIBRS. Now, as of 2023, and that is the most recent version of the FBI's NIBRS user manual, which we'll provide a link to as part of the resources for this, there are 71 what we call Group A offenses measured in NIBRS. Group A offenses are ones that there is a complete incident report taken on. And I'll talk a little bit about what those crimes are. They're going to collect information about victim characteristics, offenders, an arrestee, whether or not the incident was cleared by police, if that clearance was by an arrest. And they're going to collect all the required information for that particular Group A offense, whether it be a property crime, what we call a crime against society, or a crime against persons. Now, a lot of people mostly focus on these Group A offenses. But there's also another segment in NIBRS that gets less attention that I wanted to mention, and it's the Group B segment. A lot of smaller agencies may submit only Group B segment and not Group A. Group B is just it's a set of 10 offenses for which NIBRS collects only arrest information and arrestee information on. So those 71 crimes, those separate offenses are spread across, they're kind of organized in 3 ways. There's crimes against persons, crimes against property, and crimes against society. Here, I've sort of condensed all of the different crimes against persons offenses that NIBRS does capture, but right away, you're going to see some differences with the NCVS. The most obvious being that NIBRS captures murder. Some jurisdictions call it non-negligent manslaughter. We also capture negligent manslaughter. We also capture kidnapping and abduction. And actually that's repeated right there, and also instances of statutory rape and incest and human trafficking for purposes of commercial sex acts and for purposes of involuntary servitude. And so we also capture the similar types of crimes to the NCVS. So simple assault. I know that there is a stalking supplement to the NCVS. NIBRS captures a crime called intimidation, which includes stalking, according to the NIBRS technical specification. And we also capture simple assault and aggravated assault and different forms of rape and sexual assault. And by sexual assault, I mean fondling, and also robbery. Crimes against property is one of probably the most vast section of NIBRS, where you get the most detailed, nuanced sort of set of offenses. In the past, with the summary reporting system, for example, one of the 10 crimes they would count is larceny theft. Well, larceny theft in NIBRS is broken out into 8 different types of larceny theft. It gets highly specific. Didn't list those all here, but one of the benefits of NIBRS, why we wanted to switch the nation to an IBR, sort of more expansive NIBRS system than SRS, is because now we capture what type of larceny. It gets as specific as larceny from a coin-operated machine. There is larceny from a building. There is pickpocketing. There's shoplifting. All these different codes exist now to provide greater specificity and to understand part of the context, behind what theft looks like. Same goes for fraud. And this is one of the biggest expansions, I think, in NIBRS, is adding these sets of fraud offenses. And again, there's a lot of specificity that's allowed here for fraud. There's 8 different types that you can capture in NIBRS. And it includes crimes that we didn't capture before, like identity theft, computer hacking, and invasion cases. All those are in there. And, they also capture counterfeit and forgery, which is sort of a specific, it's separate from fraud, but sort of similar. And then there's charges of embezzlement, extortion, blackmail, bribery, in addition to the traditional crimes we always measured, and that are also measured in the NCVS, such as burglary and motor vehicle theft. You will notice that robbery is on this slide. Technically, robbery is a crime against property in NIBRS. This often causes a little bit of confusion. At BJS, we count it in our reports, we include it with violent crimes. It is sort of a methodological artifact of the NIBRS system. That is why it's classified as a crime against property. By doing that, robbery incidents will they automatically will generate what's called a property segment, which means you can understand what property was stolen, potentially estimate the value of it, although that's risky. And you can also look and see whether or not whatever was stolen during that robbery was recovered. But like violent crimes, robbery gets counted a little bit differently. It gets counted as a crime against persons, and each victim of a robbery is counted as a robbery victim. So even though it is classified as a crime against property, I just wanted to mention that we do often, for reports and whatnot, include it as a violent crime. And then this is also new, and some of the newest offenses added to NIBRS are included in this area. Crimes against society, where society, the betterment of society, is considered the victim. And that includes cases of animal cruelty, all of the drug violations, so either possession or sale or drug equipment violations are going to be there, along with all gambling offenses. And all of these are broader categories that include multiple types of each of these, particularly gambling and prostitution, pornography and obscene material, and also weapon law violations. And that is one that actually gets a lot of interest in the NIBRS data. That includes cases where, let's say, law enforcement, pulls someone over, they find a gun that is illegal to own or possess, either because of the gun itself or that person. It would go in something like weapons law violations. Oh, goodness. I'm sorry, folks. The slides just flew up. Apologize. I am going to try to advance these another way. Just bear with me. So those are the crimes NIBRS captures. And so those ones that I just presented, together they make up 71 offenses. The ones that I left off are specific to federal law enforcement or maybe tribal law enforcement agencies. Those include crimes like espionage, immigration violations, tax crimes, things like that. Those offenses have been recently added to in an effort to increase reporting among federal law enforcement agencies. Now, those are just the crimes that generate an incident report and incident data in NIBRS. Once those crimes exist, that incident occurs, there are additional indicators that NIBRS collects about those. They are too many really to list onto a single slide. We have tried to here to the best that we can. I think this is pretty comprehensive, but there are characteristics of individuals. For every offense, there will be characteristics of an offender, and if there is an arrest, an arrestee. Now, whether or not those characteristics are known to law enforcement at the time is another matter, but they are expected to be collected. When crimes involve persons as victims, you will also get information about the victim's characteristics. And I want to mention in particular, age, race, and the sex of offenders and victims and arrestees are included. A lot of questions that we get are about ethnicity. NIBRS measures ethnicity as Hispanic origin, yes or no. It's a simple flag, and it is regardless of race. That data element is not required for law enforcement agencies to collect. And so the level of coverage and responsiveness on that particular data element, can be sparse, and it depends on the state. So that's just something I want to mention. We do often get questions about why we don't see ethnicity reported more. If it's an arrest of a juvenile, you will get what the disposition is for that juvenile. But I think a lot of the most informative aspects about some of these incidents come from the incident characteristics that NIBRS collects for these crimes. Not only can you get information on multiple offenders, victims, and multiple offenses within a NIBRS incident, there are also additional information you can get for certain crimes. So for most crimes, you're going to have the identification of the agency itself, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. It allows us to do analyses at local levels or at state levels, so subnational analyses of the NIBRS data. If it's a property crime, you're going to get the property loss type, whether it was recovered. If it's drugs, you will get an estimate of what that drug is, the actual drug itself. Sometimes there will be quantity values. If it's a burglary, you will see something like what you see on the right, the method of entry, whether or not it was forced, the number of premises entered. So there is a lot of detail, as you can see. But one thing I wanted to mention that a lot of folks aren't as familiar with is that for a select set of crimes, there are even additional sort of contextual indicators collected. So for example, for these crimes that you were about to see, counterfeit forgery, some of the, stolen property, drugs, weapons law violations, pornography and obscene material. For those crimes, you're also going to get an additional set of data, potentially. They're called criminal activity data elements. So for example, if you have a crime of pornography and obscene material, law enforcement can flag whether or not it also involved both the production of it, the buying of it, and the exploitation of children as part of that. If you are, let's say, if there is a drug offense for possession or for sales, you can get additional information on the context of that crime, such as whether or not you were transporting it, importing it, buying, or whether you were cultivating it, for example. So that's some of the rich level of data that you can get in NIBRS. Now, there are going to be some updates to NIBRS. I won't get into this too much. This is sort of the lane for the FBI, but one thing I want to mention that is coming soon, in fact, the state of Virginia is already implementing it for their law enforcement agencies, and all of them do report NIBRS, and that is the addition of a firearm discharge indicator for violent crime and an addition of a gunshot wound as injury to the victim. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is so important and how it represents a key distinction between how NIBRS might measure a type of crime, gun violence in this instance, and how the NCVS, the kind of detail they're able to gather from their household survey about gun violence. One of the key things that I think represents a departure between these two data sources is, and I mentioned this earlier, is how they're collected. One is a household survey. One comes from administrative records from police departments. And I think it's absolutely crucial if you're using the NIBRS data to understand that pipeline, where these data truly come from. The NIBRS data represents an attempt to get data on crime from almost 19,000 law enforcement agencies in the US. It's a little bit less than that are enrolled in the UCR program. I think it's around 18,800 for 2022 and 2023. And so, out of that, you've got about 78.6% that have actually been certified and submitted their data. And these are a diverse array of agencies. You're talking about agencies, that are in remote, maybe tribal areas, small rural communities, university and campus law enforcement agencies, in addition to, Atlanta Police Department or Dallas Police Department, Philadelphia, Chicago. These are all agencies that are also submitting NIBRS data now. So it is a diverse, complex process because the data flows from these agencies to their respective state UCR program. Errors have to be corrected, and then eventually it goes to the FBI. And this is really how it starts. I mean, just if we want to talk about data quality and we want to talk about using, these data for statistical purposes, this is something that I cannot stress enough. This is how a lot of these incidents start. It is in a patrol unit entering crime, entering incident-based information in a mobile field report, application, either on their Toughbook or on an iPad. That's where the data is initially getting entered for the most part, and it goes into a records management system. And a lot of that information may be complete at the time of the incident when they're sitting there entering it. Some of it may not be. The thing about NIBRS is that it does represent this monumental shift in the how standardized data is that law enforcement submits to the FBI. In a monument, I mean, a lot of them were collecting this incident-based data, rich data, especially about gun violence or about victims, for many years. Maybe they were collecting information about gangs, or about drug sales or something like that. Intelligence-based, data collection. A lot of agencies were collecting this, but it wasn't standardized or the same set of data, rich incident-based data that maybe another agency was collecting, meaning we couldn't compare across jurisdictions. Now it's standardized with NIBRS, and this represents a pretty big shift in how agencies report their data, even though the NIBRS data, being incident-based, essentially replicates what the law enforcement IBR structure of their records are. This is how they operated, for many, many years. But now we're seeing it go up to the state and to the federal level in a standardized uniform format. Now, this is essentially what happens. This is a very simplified version of this, but essentially at the time of the incident, someone in the community or the victim or the officer can report that crime to law enforcement. They're going to record that information in what I've called here their LE system, their law enforcement system. And most people refer to this as an RMS, a records management system that stores all of this incident-based data. Some of that information may not be known, as you can see at the innermost box. They may not know whether or not the arrest was, or there was an arrest made. They may not know the injury status of the victim. They may not know if there was a weapon present at the time or the precise drug type or quantity that is there. I bring all this up to just emphasize that there is a flow of information that connects a lot of these incidents into one incident that then makes its way up, to the federal level. And that's important to understand. There may be some incidents that get submitted that throw error warnings, and I'll talk in a minute about what those are, or that have errors in them. They get rejected, and then local law enforcement have to go back, correct those, and send them back. So it is a complex process. And this is the pipeline. It goes from local law enforcement or state police, whichever the law enforcement agency is. It could be police departments, a sheriff's office. It then goes to their state uniform crime reporting program office, which then pipelines that data to the FBI. That way the FBI is receiving, data mostly from, the states, 50 states, maybe DC, instead of, close to 19,000 law enforcement agencies. And I mentioned errors versus warnings just a minute ago, and I want to raise this as sort of an issue, something for folks to think about when they're working with the data. You will see many instances where a data element that's required is unknown, or you might see an entry for a drug quantity or the value of property that just seems off, or like a guess. Well, that's for a reason. Some things, law enforcement is allowed to estimate and to try to guess at. Certain things will trip warnings in an incident report. That incident report will not get rejected, but it gets flagged. So for example, the FBI wants to flag if you've left out ethnicity. It is not required, so it's just a warning. However, let's say you forgot race and it is a homicide, a crime against a person. The NIBRS system will not accept that incident report if race is missing. It could say unknown, but it cannot be blank, for example. Weapon or force use cannot be blank. An error would mean that incident report gets kicked out and gets sent back to the state and to that agency. And then the question is, how was it resolved? And was it resolved? Was it resubmitted? These are things that users should think about. Okay, these are some of the challenges with NIBRS warnings and errors. It's unclear the extent to which a lot of these errors and these, the rejected records, those errors versus warnings, how much they impact crime data. But we know that the potential exists. So property value losses that people rely on for planning and resources, that might be incorrect for a jurisdiction. But one that we really, I think, wrestle with, and that's why I call it out on this slide for folks, is the presence of unknown. You tend to see, so for violent crime in particular, there are certain data elements that you saw on a previous slide that are absolutely required. If it is a violent crime or a robbery, you must collect information about the victims, the offenders, property stolen, something like that. For a lot of violent crime, not a lot, but for a non-trivial portion of violent crimes, you will see unknown for a victim, less so for victims, but for things like offender race, offender sex, and particularly for relationship of the victim to the offender, which is one of the most really one of the biggest value added, components of NIBRS versus the old SRS system, is knowing now for violent crime, the relationship between the victim and offender. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. There are a substantial number, of some of those incidents, a non-trivial number that just say unknown, that masks the nature of violence, and that is problematic. And so that is something to look out for and to do a little bit of more research on. But the biggest issue, and something I point out to folks, is errors and warnings that are not flagged in the NIBRS system. And this is where the FBI's quality assurance program comes in. They do a great job. They actually do site visits where they can do an audit of incident reports. But this is one of the biggest distinctions, I think, that exists between a household survey like the NCVS and NIBRS. There are things that the NIBRS quality control systems cannot flag as an error. So for example, I had a jurisdiction once who submitted some robbery data, and I was analyzing their robbery data. And all of a sudden I found out that they had no victims other than people. Well, that might not throw an error, right? We know that robbery involves person victims. The problem is that in NIBRS, robbery also has the chance to have other types of victims, such as banks that are robbed, even governments that have been robbed. You can even have a robbery of commercial establishments, like a convenience store or a mall. Well, we found out that they just weren't reporting them. They just weren't reporting those victims. That would never show up in an error warning, So these are just things to think about. And it's really sort of driven by that local and state nature of the data and that pipeline as it makes its way up to the federal government. And there's constant training going on between the FBI and other organizations and local law enforcement to sort of deal to kind of enhance training and understanding of NIBRS so that those situations don't happen. I want to just wrap up this part about NIBRS by briefly talking about how BJS uses it. Typically what BJS does is we use the data a lot for, these are just some strengths of NIBRS that I'm going to talk about. We primarily use the data for statistical reports that use the NIBRS data. A big component of our work with NIBRS is producing what's called the NIBRS National Estimates. As part of the NIBRS National Estimation Program, which is a joint effort between the FBI and BJS to take the NIBRS data, and even though it is not 100% coverage of the US population, we take the NIBRS data and we weight it up to provide national estimates of crime based on NIBRS. So we use that not just for statistical reports and for putting out national estimates of crime, which is a big piece of NIBRS, but we also use the NIBRS data for formula grant calculations. And those have obviously important implications for local and state jurisdictions who rely on those dollars, maybe for burn jag money, for example, or to hire additional police officers. So there are a multitude of ways BJS works with the NIBRS data and uses it, even though we don't administer it. So I just want to briefly cap off with just a couple of the strengths of NIBRS. The breadth and scope of crimes captured is unmatched. We're up to 71 different offenses now, and we particularly have lots of detail about different types of fraud and different types of property theft, or I'm sorry, property crime. And another big strength, and this kind of leads into what I'm about to talk about, is that it provides context we didn't have before. So for example, now I'm able to view whether or not, just to give an example, for animal cruelty, one of the newer offenses added to NIBRS, you can now get specific information about the circumstances of that animal cruelty, whether or not it involved, let's say, organized dogfighting, for example, versus neglect versus intentional abuse. Those are the types of additional, elements that we can get about crime that give us crucial context. So, for example, we know, if you see a rise in animal cruelty cases, what is it? Is it organized dogfighting, or is it that people are being, neglectful of their pets? Those have important public policy and policing implications for how to address those crimes. But we also now have multiple types of victims. I just mentioned robbery earlier. We had no indicator, really, about the extent of how many robberies and what types of robberies impacted businesses versus individuals who are threatened or in a robbery incident. And now one of the best things, I think one of the most useful value-added pieces of NIBRS is that now we can look at crime incident information with multiple victims. And so, for example, we can discover, and this is true in some jurisdictions, that robberies, not uncommon for them to involve 2 to 3 victims. We can now look at things like homicides. Well, we could do that before, but especially non-fatal gun violence, for example. And we could see if there were 4, 5, 6 victims involved, if it was a mass incident. And we can also look, and this is another thing that I think is very valuable, at crimes for a wider range of victims. Because it's law enforcement and they serve the public, the victims that are in NIBRS range from 0, okay, meaning newborns, all the way up to 99. Any age over 98, 99 is capped, but it runs the full spectrum. With the NCVS, they capture crimes because it's a household survey and they're talking to persons. Their survey information is capped at, you must be at least 12 years old to answer those questions. And so one of the things about NIBRS that I think has provided a lot of value for us is it's opened our eyes about the volume and the types of cases that involve very young children that law enforcement are handling. We did not have a good picture of that before. And each of these incidents in NIBRS, each of these victimizations, for the first time, we can trace them directly to the law enforcement outcome. So for each Group A incident, you're going to know whether or not law enforcement cleared that crime. And by cleared, I mean essentially solved it, right? They identified a suspect, they were, and they had sufficient probable cause to effect an arrest. Now they can clear that by an arrest, or they can clear it some other way, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, but we've never had arrest information that we could tie to a specific incident and type of victim and offender before. And that's an important advancement. Now, there are some limits. Police data is not a complete picture of crime. In NIBRS, we do not yet have an indicator of the number of crimes that come to police's attention that are unfounded. And we also know that there are certain crimes that are much less likely to be reported to police. And that is where the value of the NCVS really becomes apparent, is the ability to capture crimes not reported to police. Another limitation of NIBRS that I mentioned earlier, we have no indicator as yet of gun discharge. In NIBRS, we are able to see the number of violent crimes, and there's even some crimes like, extortion and blackmail where you can have a gun present. But for the most part, violent crimes, we can see whether a gun was present in all of those incidents. However, there is no indicator of how that gun was used. We have no way, we know that it was there, it had the potential for harm, for example, but we don't know if that gun was fired at a victim, if it was just brandished. And if the victim suffers an injury, let's say a serious injury, one could try to assume that it was a gunshot injury, but there is no indication of that yet. Agencies are starting to roll that into their NIBRS data collection systems now, and it is being implemented into NIBRS, I believe, next year. But there is no indicator if a victim is injured, if it is a gunshot wound. It could be that a person was shot at, but not actually injured by that gun. They could have been pistol whipped. So there's a little bit of fuzziness, right, with the way that NIBRS measures gun violence. The other thing about NIBRS is it is not as flexible and nimble in some ways as the NCVS. It gives you lots of flexibility in the types of crimes you can measure, lots of geographic flexibility. I can look at crime at local levels, state levels, or national levels. But I can't quickly turn around that ship and, let's say, do a quick survey or an add-on of, some sort of unique offense type that people are interested in that year. So for example, active shooters. We can't, it's like steering a large oil tanker. There's no way to quickly, add that on to a NIBRS data collection to where it would get imported into 19,000 law enforcement agency systems to where they could then report it to the FBI. So it is, any changes made to NIBRS is a multi-year process, kind of like changing the census in some ways. So it is sort of an unwieldy large tool in that sense. So I want to wrap up by just briefly mentioning a few of the findings from NIBRS. And these are not just findings that, I didn't want to just present findings you may have seen in a report. I want to sort of show you ways, the possible, right? Here's some of the possible things that you could find in NIBRS in addition to things that have been published. And before I go into this, I wanted to just make 3 critical distinctions. There are NIBRS data released in different formats, and it can be confusing to users if they're not familiar with them all. Some of the NIBRS data you're going to see here comes from our National Estimates Program, released by the FBI, also BJS, where we have taken NIBRS data in 2021 and in 2022 and weighted it up to be nationally representative. In some cases, we did the same for certain states. And weighting and imputation procedures are a core part of that. That is how they were, how we were able to create national estimates based on NIBRS. LEARCAT is the BJS law enforcement reported crime analysis tool. It has NIBRS data from 2016 to 2022, but it is not nationally representative. It is simply all of the data submitted to NIBRS as reported. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to show you a couple of snapshots from LEARCAT and how you can go in there and answer some of the questions you may have about crime. And then there's another form, another source of NIBRS data, the BJS NIBRS extract files. These are concatenated files that we store at the University of Michigan's, we call it the NACJD, it's the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data at ICPSR at the University of Michigan. Those are concatenated files where you do not have to do any database management. You do not have to do any concatenation or programming, let's say in Stata or SPSS or, some other commercial off-the-shelf statistical program. You do not have to combine all those segments together. BJS has done the work for you. And we have victim extracts, offender extracts, where we have come in, for example, in a victim extract, and we've, for that victimization, connected all of the important information about the offender, the arrest, and the incident to that victimization, things that exist in the other segments. And that's very helpful. It's a flat file that you can ingest into a statistical program. And so I just want to mention that some of our findings are based on that. I just mentioned the national estimates. This is one of the biggest ways, and probably I think one of the most prominent ways that BJS works with the NIBRS data and our role in the NIBRS data. And I show this slide. This is from Crime in the United States for 2022. So these are 2022 national estimates. And I show this slide not because it's, particularly fancy or, it is, I feel like it's important to step back and think about where we've come from. So in 2022, because of the national estimates, we now know that almost a third, so 28% of all of the violent victimizations against women were committed by an intimate partner. Well, that number's 7% for men. Violence committed by otherwise unknown offenders, that looks very different for males. It accounts for over half of their violent victimization. It's much more rare for females. So intimate partner violence tends to have a female victim much more often than a male victim. Strangers, unknown offenders, the victim tends to be male than female. For so many years, we didn't know that. And I think it's easy to lose our appreciation of that. It wasn't until 2021 that we had a national estimate of intimate partner violence, for example, from law enforcement data, to where we could look at it both nationally and at the local level. And so I just want to, kind of mention that point that it might seem quaint, right? But we didn't have that for a long time. These are national estimates of homicide. Now, homicide, we have had national estimates for a long time. But what's nice about NIBRS, and the reason why I want to show this slide, and this shows 2022 homicide information for victims by age on the left. And then on the right, you've got the number of victims per fatal gun violence incident. What's valuable about this is you could produce this before from supplementary homicide report data. But with NIBRS, we now have this for non-fatal gun violence. And you could go into the CDE, which I'll talk about in a minute from the FBI, or you can go into Learcat, and you can pull up this type of information for non-fatal violence now. And it has been kind of a game changer to be able to say that the vast majority of gun violence in America is non-lethal. We knew that guns primarily drove homicides for many, many years because we had that information as part of the UCR, but we didn't for non-fatal violence. And so this is another sort of big step for us. You can go and explore the possible in all the different ways you can kind of slice and dice this data in the BJS Learcat. It is online. You can access it through the BJS website. And as I mentioned earlier, these are not national estimates in here. This is a place for users to go and explore the data as it's reported. So for example, you're going to see states with different colors there. Those dark blue states, those are what we call our full reporter states. Coverage and participation in NIBRS is so high, at least 90% of the population covered, that the data we essentially treated as self-representing for that state, meaning the state of Texas right there that I've highlighted, the data there, we can say Texas is self-representing. So we can analyze, crime rates, crime counts, percentages for Texas and Learcat, and be assured, feel comfortable that these represent all crimes reported by law enforcement in the state of Texas for that year. So these are not, they are representative of certain cities in certain states. So Texas is representative, Washington, Oregon, all the ones you see in dark blue, but not nationally. So I just want to point that out. And you can go in and start to explore the data and what you can do with it at the state level and the local level. So for example, you can quickly go in and you can say, okay, in Texas, I know in 2022 that property crime accounted for just over half of all crime. And you can get a quick snapshot of what their distribution of crime looks like, how many violent crime incidents they recorded, and how many victimizations, separate victimizations, those incidents accounted for. So what you can see, and this is nice to be able to see because it helps us understand multi-victim incidents. There were 88,000 incidents, but it accounted for 105,000 victimizations. You can calculate crime rates for the state, but you can even go a little bit more granular. And you can start to explore data for the largest city PDs in the United States here. And so in the case of Texas, sorry, I'm still picking on you, Texas, you can go in and explore Houston PD. It's one of the top, the number 4 largest agency in America. It's in the top 5. I apologize. I should know this. It's either 4, it might be number 4. But we have just tons of volume of data there, freely available. You can download it as a CSV and start to explore all of this. Just a quick couple of taps in Learcat, and I'm able to see for Houston PD in 2022, the distribution of what their crime looked like. Not shocking, it was, heavily dominated by simple assaults, intimidation and stalking, aggravated assault, robbery, rape. These are for their violent crimes, by the way. And I focused on robbery here just to show something that a lot of folks really, they're not familiar with the NIBRS data, either because it hasn't been promoted or they haven't seen a publication with it. So I just wanted to call out also that underneath, I clicked on robbery right here, as you can see, just so I could see what share of all violent crime, robbery consists of, what kind of volume is Houston PD working with, on robbery versus other types of violent crimes. And what you can see is that businesses are not, businesses make up a substantial portion of the victims there. And what you can do with that information is then subset the data by victim type and look at the distinct characteristics of robberies where, businesses were victimized in addition to persons. And that, just takes a few clicks. You can also go in and construct some custom cross-tabulation tables. And I want to mention this because it is one of the key ways that the Learcat and its NIBRS data functions differs from the FBI's Crime Data Explorer, which also visualizes NIBRS data. Here you can go in and make selections and build your own tables. They're not just pre-populated. And what you can see right here is that I've gone in and selected victimizations. I've just gone ahead and selected a wide variety of states. I think I've got all my full reporter states there: Arkansas, Colorado, Connecticut. And I've selected 2022, and I've looked at kidnapping and abduction. That's something that's not measured in the NCVS. It's a crime for which people, I think, are, there is a little bit of concern about it when it maybe involves young children. Well, you can quickly go in here and look at kidnapping victimizations by age and who the victim offender relationship is, and generate a custom table for yourself. And I've got it here by state, victim ages. Well, and you're going to see some shading here. And what that shading is, it's almost like a hotspot feature. It's going to the section of that table where it's, the cases are clustered, essentially. And so right now there, it's clustered on intimate partner kidnapping and abduction cases. There are a significant number in Colorado of adults. And so you really don't see that many cases for very young victims, but when you do, it's not strangers, right? You tend to see it for other family. So that was just a quick table I ran in ways that you can explore the data. You can also go in and calculate your own incident-based crime rates. If you go out and let's say you see crime rates in a report that are intriguing but don't necessarily get at what you're interested in, you can go in here and calculate your own crime rates. And here I've done that. We do it for person crimes. And here I generated crime rates in the state of victimization rates in the state of Colorado for firearm violence. Any violent crime where a firearm was present by the type of gun. And what you can see in the state of Colorado in 2022 by the shading is that the vast majority of those cases are against gun violence incidents involve male Black victims that are between the ages of 15 and 34. Again, very quick. You can pull those rates and see how much higher they are for persons in that group compared to persons, let's say you've got Asians right here by age, and then to the right of the table, you see other racial groups. I'm running short on time, so I'm going to speed this up, but just so you know, the key thing about NIBRS that I think one of the things I highlighted earlier is our ability to go into that data and see critical information about violence against very young children who are younger than 12. And so I just want to mention one resource if you're interested in that. We have a BJS report on the topic of rape and sexual assault. It's an online dynamic report. It's interactive. It uses NIBRS data for states that have full reporting status, meaning the data fully cover the population there and the data are self-representing for that state. And one thing I highlight in this slide is really sort of two key features of NIBRS that I think are invaluable. You can compare across places, which is why it's standardized. If you want to understand why there are certain people, let's say there is a string of sexual assaults against elderly victims in a community out in California, you could go in and look for the same characteristics and see if there are other jurisdictions who are experiencing the same thing. It's a fairly rare occurrence, right? You can compare rates across these states and maybe try to, maybe reach out to those jurisdictions. But the reason I showed this one about sexual assault is because this was a report where we thought it would just be a very broad overview of sexual assault. And quickly what we discovered was that it highlighted that it's very young victims that are the bulk, or young victims, I should say, that are the bulk of these, the bulk of victims of sexual assault. And that is constant across all of the states. What does vary across the states, and why you see them side by side here, is the magnitude of the disparity. So children are 4 times more likely to be a victim of sexual assault in Tennessee. It's 7 times more likely than than adults in Michigan in 2019. So it's the same pattern, but these differences in magnitude are pretty evident when you start looking at the NIBRS data on a state-by-state basis. And this is what I mean when I said we realized very quickly that this was a story about sexual assault in children. You could go online to the report, and there is a link to it right here. And what you would see, and here I just selected Michigan, is that 2/3 of all sexual assaults, the victims are a child under age 18. And that varies. So if you look up here, I just want to mention on the upper left-hand corner, those pink bars that you see represent the share of all violent victimization for that age group that consists of sexual assault. And so once you look at, let's say, for children 5 to 13, what you can see is that sexual assault made up 70% of all the violence they experienced. It consisted of sexual assault. And so NIBRS really provides a crucial window we were missing into that type of dynamic. And we can go further with the data and see that when we look at these children who are below age 12, here we've got 5 to 13 and under 5, when they, we know that sexual assault represents the bulk of their victimizations, and it's not strangers who are doing most of it. This dark green line is family, and so that helps, that kind of rich information helps us have more informed conversations about crime. It helps us dispel myths and fears that maybe aren't necessarily supported by the statistics. One of the findings that, and this is something we found in almost every state, one thing that tends to surprise audiences that I've talked to is how the proportion of these sexual assaults that you see in that light lime green color, those are the ones committed by strangers. It's actually a much smaller portion of sexual assaults against children. The share of sexual assaults committed by a stranger actually goes up as you get older, rather than the other way around. So I just want to close this part on NIBRS by just sort of highlighting a couple of NIBRS publications you can check out on the BJS website. I know this was a wham bam, whiz bang overview of NIBRS. But now we are going to transition to the National Crime Victimization Survey. And I would like to introduce my colleague, Susanna, who will be discussing this section.
Thank you, Kim. I'm just going to give you an introduction to the National Crime Victimization Survey, or as we call it, the NCVS. The NCVS is the longest-running victimization survey in the United States, having celebrated its 50th anniversary this past September. The sample gets redesigned every year to align with the decennial census to ensure that it is representative of the population. The NCVS has undergone many changes over the years, such as supplements being added to look at specific types of crime. And the NCVS recently underwent a redesign, and the redesigned instrument is in the field now. So what is the National Crime Victimization Survey? The NCVS is the nation's primary source of information on criminal victimization. Sponsored and directed by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, BJS. It started in 1972 as the National Crime Survey and was redesigned and renamed the National Crime Victimization Survey in 1992. It was developed to complement and serve as an independent calibration of the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program. And up until this redesign, the NCVS had remained relatively unchanged since 1993. The NCVS is unique in that it includes both crimes reported and not reported to police, so it serves as a measure of unreported crime. The NCVS can also be used to provide a measure of victim risk and serve as an indicator of change over time. The NCVS is administered by the U.S. Census Bureau on behalf of BJS, and it's to a nationally representative sample of persons aged 12 or older living in U.S. households. So these are households only, so institutionalized populations, people who are unhomed, living on military bases are not included. Each year, data are collected from 130,000 households, which comprises about 220,000 persons. In 2022, 64% of eligible households completed interviews, and within participating households, interviews were completed with 962 persons, which is an 82% unweighted response rate. The NCVS uses a panel design. Respondents can complete up to 7 interviews over the course of 3.5 years, which is 1 interview every 6 months. The NCVS is a self-report survey where persons are asked about criminal victimization that they experienced in the prior 6 months, and it's an incident-based survey, which means information is collected about each victimization incident. The NCVS collects data on violent crimes, including rape and sexual assault, robbery, aggravated assault, and simple assault. So in the NCVS, we do consider robbery a person crime and a violent crime. Property crime is household level crime, and it is information is collected from the household representative who answers questions about property crime for that whole household. NCVS also includes personal larceny, which is purse snatching and pocket picking. And violent crime and larceny are both measured at the person level, and property crime is at the household level. The NCVS can be used to produce estimates for the population, but the sample size is large enough that it can also be used to produce estimates for various subgroups, such as persons age 65 or older. There are also supplements to the NCVS, and these are short topical surveys. They're administered at the end of the NCVS interview to eligible respondents. So you must complete the base NCVS interview to be eligible for a supplement. There are sometimes additional eligibility criteria for participating in a supplement. For example, the police public contact survey is only administered to persons age 16 or older and not age 12 or older. Supplements are usually in the field for 6 months, either January through June or July through December. And in recent years, BJS has administered 5 different supplements on a rotating basis, including the Identity Theft Supplement, the Police Public Contact Survey, the School Crime Supplement, the Supplemental Fraud Survey, and the Supplemental Victimization Survey, which measures stalking. So for a selected household, when a household is selected for the NCVS, a U.S. Census Bureau representative contacts that household, and they first speak to the household respondent. The household respondent is the most knowledgeable adult household member and someone who is unlikely to leave the household. They speak to the household representative to confirm that they have contacted the correct sample household, and they collect demographic information such as age, race, Hispanic origin, sex, marital status, and educational attainment for all persons age 12 or older living in that household. And they use this to develop the household roster of persons age 12 or older who will then be interviewed. All respondents answer questions about personal crime. These questions are written in a short Q format. The interviewer reads a question stem about whether the respondent has experienced a type of crime incident, and then gives examples of that incident or short cues to prompt the respondent's memory. For example, they might ask, in the past 6 months, that is, since month X in 2023, was something belonging to you stolen, such as things you carry, like luggage, a wallet, purse, or briefcase. If a crime incident is reported, they then move to the Crime Incident Report, or CIR, and this is used to gather detailed information about incidents reported. The CIR is an attribute or incident based, and questions are focused on details regarding the criminal incident. For example, what time did the incident happen? One CIR is completed for each crime incident that is reported. There's an exception to this. Series victimizations are victimizations that are similar in nature and occur with such frequency that the victim is unable to recall each event or describe each event in detail. For example, domestic violence or bullying at school. If interviewers can identify and classify these similar victimizations as series victimizations, they only collect the detailed information in the CIR on the most recent incident in the series. The CIR is used for crime incidents. So after confirming a crime is committed, the survey concludes with some basic demographic questions, and then in some cases, a supplemental survey. So there are multiple types of units of analysis that can be used when analyzing NCVS data. Household estimates are based on counting the number of households that are affected by a crime. So the unit of analysis is the household. So in this example, you can see household 1 experienced 4 victimizations and household 2 experienced 1, but collectively we would say there are 5 property victimizations among this group of 10 households. Victimization estimates are based on counting the victimizations. And if you're wondering about how serious crimes are handled, as information is only collected about the most recent incident when a serious crime is reported, respondents who report a serious crime are asked to estimate how many times the serious crime occurred, and that number is recorded, but we do cap it at 10 to avoid the effect of extreme outliers. So in this figure, you can see person 1 experienced 3 victimizations and person 2 experienced 4. So out of these 10 people, we would say that they experienced 7 victimizations. So this is different from incident estimates, which are based on counting incidents, because one incident can include multiple people. If you and your partner, who is also participating in the NCVS, are both robbed at the same time, we don't want to count that as 2 robbery incidents. Respondents are asked if there is anyone with them during the incident, and incident estimates are adjusted to account for the fact that the same incident may be reported by multiple people. So in this example, there's only 1 incident among these 10 people, even though there were 2 victims. We also look at prevalence estimates, and prevalence is based on counting victims instead of victimizations. Each person or household in the survey is classed as either a victim or not a victim, and it does not matter how many times they were victimized. So a person who was robbed once and a person who was robbed 5 times are both counted as victims. Prevalence is useful because it can tell us the percent of persons within the population who experienced an event such as a crime. So in this example, there are 2 victims among these 10 people. Victimization estimates are often presented as rates. In BJS publications using NCVS data, we present the victimization rate per 1,000 people during a specific period of time. So the violent victimization rate is equal to the number of victimizations reported during that given time period divided by the number of persons in the population, and that would be only persons aged 12 or older, and then you multiply that by 1,000. For property victimization, it's the number of property victimizations divided by the number of households in the population. So let's go through an example. There were about 6.6 million victimizations reported in 2022, and the estimated population of persons aged 12 or older was around 282 million. So you just divide the roughly 6.6 million by the 282 million and multiply 1,000, and then you get the victimization rate for 2022 that will match what we publish. And in 2022, there were 23.5 violent victimizations per 1,000 persons aged 12 or older in the United States. BJS publishes a number of reports using data from the NCVS and also the supplement that you can check out on the NCVS data collection page. There's a full list of the reports that have come out. Now I'm going to talk briefly about some recent findings from one of our reports, Victimization 2022, which I co-authored with Lexi Thompson, who you will hear from shortly. This chart shows the distribution of violent victimizations in 2022. And as a reminder, violent victimization includes rape or sexual assault, robbery, aggravated assault, and simple assault. And in 2022, the majority of violent crimes were simple assaults at about 58%, followed by aggravated assault, robbery, and then rape or sexual assault. One of the advantages of the NCVS remaining largely unchanged since 1993 is that it allows us to look at trends over time. So in 2022, there were 23.5 victimizations per 1,000 persons. And this was up from a 30-year low in the NCVS that occurred in 2020 and 2021. But over the last 30 years, violent victimization has actually declined 71%. From 79.8 per 1,000 to 23.5 per 1,000 from 1993 to 2022. And the rate of violent victimization reported to police over that same 30-year time period has also trended downwards. I mentioned earlier that the NCVS includes crimes reported and not reported to police. And if you're wondering who would not report a crime, victims may not report a crime for a variety of reasons, including fear of reprisal or fear of getting the offender in trouble, believing the police would or could not do anything to help, believing the crime was a personal issue, or that it was too trivial to report. Reporting to police may occur immediately following a criminal incident or a later date, and police may be notified by the victim, a third party, including witnesses, other victims or household members, or police may have actually been at the scene of the incident. And in 2022, about 2 out of 5, or 40%, of the violent victimizations were reported to police. The NCVS also measures crimes such as intimate partner violence, which is violence committed by a current or former spouse, boyfriend, or girlfriend. And then domestic violence, which is violence committed by an intimate partner or another family member. I know that definitions of domestic violence do vary, so that is what is included in the NCVS. And as you can see here, in 2022, around half, or 48%, of intimate partner violence victimizations were reported to police. Looking at a 5-year trend from 2018 to 2022, we saw a decline in victimizations from 2018 through 2021, and then the overall violent victimization rate rose in 2022 to 23.5, which is actually not statistically different than it had been 5 years ago in 2018. The rate of rape or sexual assault was actually lower in 2022 than 2018, despite the fact that overall violent victimizations had risen between 2021 and 2022. But the rate of violent victimizations was higher in 2022 than 2021 for all types of crime, and for domestic violence, intimate partner violence, stranger violence, violent crime resulting in an injury, and violent crime with a weapon. Looking at property crime over the same 5-year period, property crime was lower in 2022 than it had been 5 years earlier in 2018. The rate of burglary and trespassing was also lower in 2022 than in 2018, but the rate of motor vehicle theft was higher. Looking at the rates of violent victimization by some demographic characteristics, the rate of violent victimization and violent victimization excluding simple assault increased for both males and females. The rate of violent victimization excluding simple assault increased for white and Hispanic persons. The rate of violent victimization increased for all age groups except for persons aged 50 to 64. And the rate of violent victimization increased for persons of all marital status except for widowed persons. And the rate of violent victimization and violent victimization excluding simple assault increased for persons across all income groups. So looking at the change from 2021 to 2022, overall property crime increased. It went from 90.3 in 2021 to 101.9 per 1,000 households in 2022. And the rate of motor vehicle theft and other household theft also increased over that time. Looking at crime reported to police in 2022, the rate of violent victimizations reported to police increased from 7.5 to 9.7 per 1,000. And the rate of violent victimization reported to police also increased for white and Hispanic persons, females, persons ages 12 to 17, 25 to 34, and 35 to 49, and for married persons. Of the more than 6.6 million violent victimizations in 2022, about 10% involved a firearm, and that was an increase from the 7% in 2021. And in the NCVS, firearm victimization is defined as violent victimization where the offender possessed, showed, or used a firearm. About 61% of firearm victimizations were reported to police in 2022, which was not significantly different than 2021. In addition to what was presented today, if you see our criminal victimization report, there is information on some other topics, such as percent of victims receiving assistance from a victim service provider, victimization rates by veteran status, citizen status, urbanicity, and you can also see prevalence estimates. If you would like to learn more about the NCVS, you might want to check out our new Knowledge Corner video series. Knowledge Corner videos provide quick tips and explanations for NCVS data on a variety of topics, such as weighting. The Knowledge Corner playlist is available on the Bureau of Justice Statistics YouTube page. We do have a YouTube page. And you can also check out our website. And now I am going to turn it over to Lexi.
Thank you, Susanna. And thank you again to everyone attending this webinar. This has been a knowledge-packed webinar. We've covered a lot of ground. And so I'm going to summarize some of what we've talked about, and we'll have a fun kind of quiz game for you in a bit as well. But as Kim mentioned earlier, these two data sets are meant to be complements of each other, and you can use both together to get a broader understanding of what's happening with crime in the United States. We like to say that both collections cover an overlapping but not identical set of crimes and characteristics, because there is a lot in common between the two of them, but also some key differences. This table summarizes a lot of what we have talked about already, but I'm going to go over it again in higher detail, since I know we've already been here for a bit in this webinar. So we've got some characteristics that are only for the NCVS, some characteristics that are covered by both data sets, and some characteristics only covered by NIBRS. So starting in the middle with what's covered by both data collections, we have specific crime types that are covered by both, such as rape and sexual assault, robbery, assault, burglary, motor vehicle theft, purse snatching, and pocket picking. And so while both data collections cover these crime types, it's also worth noting that even within the same crime type, there might be some slight differences, as it was alluded to earlier, between how these different crime types are measured. And I'll go into that a little bit more on the next slide. Both data collections collect different incident characteristics about the crime or criminal incident, such as both collections cover crimes reported to the police, both cover victim-offender relationship, whether a weapon was involved, if the victim was injured during the incident, and the location of the crime. Both collections also cover some victim demographics, such as race, Hispanic origin, victim sex, and crimes against persons age 12 or older. Both collections also have some indicator of whether an arrest has been made, but they're measured differently between the two collections. Kim talked about with NIBRS how they not only have arrestee data like arrestee demographics and weapon possession, they also have clearance and arrest outcomes for the criminal incidents, which are noted in the column on the right-hand side of this slide. But NCVS has a different set of questions about arrests. We have one question asking if an arrest, to the victim's knowledge, if an arrest was made, but then we also ask certain questions about, if an officer came to the scene, did that result in an arrest being made? So there's a couple different ways at the NCVS to get information about arrests, but it's not a catch-all on arrests, because one, the victim may not know if there wasn't a lot of follow-up after the incident, or depending on when we interview them, how close the interview is to the victimization. There may not have been an arrest made yet, but it may happen after the interview. In addition, there are also statistics for both data collections at not only the national level, but also subnational levels. Kim did a good demonstration of the different subnational estimates with NIBRS. Some of those are available, or a number of subnational estimates are available on the LearCat. For NCVS, it's a bit different of a process to get subnational estimates. We have a published report with direct estimates for the top 22 most populous states, but because we are a survey, we want to make sure that we're protecting the identity of our respondents. And so in order to access the more granular subnational data, you do need to submit a request through research.data.gov and go through a process with the U.S. Census Bureau to get access to that subnational information. And if someone has a question, we can answer more about that in the Q&A. Now, that's what's covered generally by both data collections. This is not a comprehensive list. None of this table is comprehensive or doesn't get everything, but it has a lot of the high points of the similarities and differences between these two data collections. Now, with just the NCVS, as mentioned by Susanna, has crimes not reported to law enforcement, which is always important to capture in some way. We're also based on a nationally representative sample. It's a household survey, as Susanna mentioned, and we weight the data for our estimates based on non-response and sample design and a number of factors. We also collect some additional demographic characteristics besides the ones I already mentioned. We also collect sexual orientation and gender identity. We also collect disability, citizenship, and veteran status of the victim. We also ask some questions in the NCVS about consequences of crime, what happens after the incident to the victim, such as socio-emotional covers, if the victim had significant problems with their friends or family or their job because of the incident, if they experienced severe anxiety and some other mental health related consequences. We also cover financial consequences and can help estimate the cost of crime using NCVS data. And then we also cover use of victim services. This could cover if the victim sought counseling after the incident or if they got legal assistance, such as for financial compensation. We ask if victims used victim services, such as those provided by a victim service provider. So that's the NCVS specifically, but now with NIBRS specifically, NIBRS has a couple crime types that the NCVS doesn't, and it's actually probably more than this list right here. But the main ones are NIBRS covers homicide or non-negligent manslaughter, human trafficking, and kidnapping. Those are not in the NCVS, but they are in NIBRS. NIBRS is also based on counts of crimes reported by law enforcement agencies, as Kim explained. And for those full reporter states like Virginia and a lot of other states on the maps you saw earlier, those are actual counts from the law enforcement agencies because there is complete reporting, but there is some estimation still at the national level because not all states are complete reporters. And then NIBRS covers crimes against some populations that the NCVS does not cover, such as persons age 11 or younger, persons who are institutionalized, persons on military bases, and crimes against entities rather than persons like commercial establishments, and crimes against society. The last two here relate to the arrestee information, which I kind of covered already. You also saw this table at the beginning of the presentation. That's from the, it's a short report that we've been doing for the last 2 years. And so typical NCVS estimates cover crimes both reported and not reported to the police. For this specific table, the NCVS rates have been calculated with only including crimes reported to police to get it a little bit closer to the definition of the NIBRS estimates. But it's worth noting again that because of the methodological differences, the definitional differences in the crime types covered, Some of these numbers are very similar between NCVS and NIBRS, and some of them are more different. For example, the rape and sexual assault row that is highlighted here, while these are both rape and sexual assaults reported to police for both data collections, there is still some difference between the numbers, and that has to do with the differences in the weighting between the data collections, and also some of the definitional differences in how rape is defined for NIBRS versus the NCVS. One example of that is while NIBRS does cover fondling or grabbing, I think it's covered under a different like category or crime type, whereas that is something that would be included in sexual assault under the NCVS. And so factors like that can contribute to why estimates might be different between the two data collections. This is very normal and expected due to all the factors that we've discussed, but that's why it's great to have both of these collections together to provide a more complete picture of crime. So now we're going to get to the fun exercise. It's technically a quiz, but it'll be a fun quiz, I promise. We are going to test your knowledge on the different data collection, on the two data collections that we've discussed throughout this webinar. So you should see a polling option pop up on the right-hand side. And I think it popped up automatically for me. So I'm going to read out the question, and then you will be able to submit your answers. I have not read the question yet, so don't submit your answer yet. But I'm going to read out the question, you'll submit your answer, and then we'll talk about what the answer is and why that is. And we're talking about different scenarios that you might want to access these data. Maybe you're thinking about different research questions and what you want to learn more about crime. Which data set is going to be the best to help answer your question? So my first question is, which data collection can help me estimate the percentage of crimes reported to police? So I'll give you about 30 seconds to put your answer in the poll, and then I'll move on to the answer, and then we'll move on to the next question. Fun to see them all coming in. I'll give a little more time. I'll give 10 more seconds in case people had a hard time finding the poll. All right, let's close the poll. So the answer is the NCVS. So I was talking about specifically the percentage of crimes reported to police. So we need both crimes reported and not reported to police to calculate that percentage. So this screenshot here is from the Criminal Victimization 2022 Bulletin, where we display the estimated percentage of crimes reported to police by the crime types covered by the NCVS. So for example, in 2022, about 42% of violent crimes were reported to the police, and about 32% of property crimes were reported to police. And this can vary year over year and also by crime type as well. So we'll move on to the second question or second poll. And the second question is, where can I access information on police clearance of violent crime incidents and how many result in arrest? So I'll give another 30 seconds for people to answer. All right, we'll close that poll. And so the answer is NIBRS, as I think a lot of you guessed for that answer. So I'll turn it over to Kim briefly, just so she can talk about police clearance and NIBRS.
Well, thank you, Lexi. So this is just one example if you wanted to understand, not only how many incidents get cleared, and in NIBRS, they do clear entire incidents. They do not clear specific offenses. And we just wanted to throw this slide up as an example from the sexual assault report that we had up earlier. The dark blue bars show the percentage of sexual assaults that were cleared by arrest. And then the sort of tan colored or peach colored bar are ones that were cleared by exceptional means, which is interesting for sexual assault. And then the yellow is not cleared. And the reason why we showed this example is because sexual assault in a lot of states, Colorado is shown here, but this is pretty prevalent in most states. The vast majority of sexual assaults are not cleared by police. That means that they were reported as crimes. It's not that they were unfounded. They just did not identify a suspect or make an arrest or have, identify probable cause or something to that effect. So almost 2/3 of them are not cleared. And it's much higher than you see for other violent crimes. The only one that sort of is similar is robbery. So you can actually look at crime clearance by type of crime, but you can also look at it as a function of the characteristics of the offenders too and the victims. So yes, NIBRS is the answer.
Woo! So moving to the next question, the third question, where can I find information about children who experience verbal bullying at school? Is it the NCVS, NIBRS, or both? I'll give 5 more seconds. Get those answers in, and we'll close the poll. I think most of you got it, or those who answered, most people got it. It is the NCVS, specifically the school crime supplement to the NCVS. When we're talking about verbal bullying, like name calling and rumor spreading, those may not always arise to crimes covered by NCVS or NIBRS, but they are covered by the school crime supplement. And so as Susanna mentioned, all of our supplements are administered after the respondent completes the core NCVS interview, which covers like the violent and property crimes. And then if they're between the ages of 12 and 17, they are then eligible to complete the SCS. And this table here is a screenshot from the Students' Reports of Bullying web tables. These are actually published by the National Center of Education Statistics, who co-sponsors this supplement with BJS. So this is found on NCES's website, and then you can also find more information on both NCES's website and BJS's website on the school crime supplement. So we're going to move to the fourth poll, which is a somewhat similar question, but different. The question is, where can I learn more about youth and crime, NCVS, NIBRS, or both? Give like 5 more seconds. All right, we'll close the poll. I think a lot of you got it. It is both. Oh, let me go to the next slide. It is both data collections. With all the kind of caveats and things that we talked about earlier in terms of reporting to police, crime types covered, but both data collections cover some aspect of youth and criminal incidents. We actually released a joint report earlier this year called Crimes Involving Juveniles on the BJS website, and that's where both of these figures come from. And so they cover data from both collections, NCVS and NIBRS, and there's a couple, I think there's like 6 different figures related to victimization, arrestee, and homicide data by age. So definitely check that out on BJS's website. Obviously, the school crime supplement, which we just talked about, relates to this as well. None of these data are school crime supplement data, but that also factors into youth and crime, so you can use the SCS as well, in addition to the core NCVS and NIBRS. So our last and final question of this poll, and then after this, we'll go over some resources, and then we'll have the Q&A at the end. But our last polling question is, where can I look for data if I'm interested in human trafficking? NCVS, NIBRS, or both? So we'll close the poll on that one. It was a bit split for that question, but the answer is NIBRS. And I'm actually, these are screenshots from Learcat, but we're going to switch directly to this slide on human trafficking. I'll let Kim explain about this a little bit more.
So human trafficking is measured in NIBRS. I do not believe they don't capture human trafficking offenses in the NCVS. NIBRS measures 2 types of human trafficking, and these are crimes that are required to be collected as part of the Uniform Crime Reporting Program in general. They put out actually individual reports just on human trafficking. The two types that they measure are human trafficking for involuntary servitude and human trafficking for purposes of commercial sex acts. And this is just a graph showing what the national estimates were for these offenses in 2022. It's an area where we are really interested in learning more about how law enforcement identifies and records these types of crimes. In 2022, we estimate there were about 2,400 victims of human trafficking for commercial sex acts. That is the bulk of human trafficking offenses that were reported. Now, just over a third of those, around 36%, those commercial sex acts, human trafficking crimes, were of children. So the victims were children in over a third of those. There were about 600 victims of human trafficking for the purposes of involuntary servitude. And that figure was up, and the difference is statistically significant. It was up about 21% from 2021. In 2021, we estimated around 500 victims of human trafficking for involuntary servitude. That was the only form of human trafficking that increased. And what this chart shows, and these are part of the national estimates that are published by the FBI in the Crime in the United States publication for 2022, is just the makeup of human trafficking victims by age and the offenders by type of human trafficking. And what we tend to see is that a significant chunk of these, where the victim is juvenile and the offender is adult, about 36% of those human trafficking for commercial sex acts, it's 36% of them are kids who are trafficked by an adult offender. Although the vast majority of human trafficking overall is adult persons trafficked by an adult offender. But these are the kinds of details we can get on it from NIBRS.
Thanks, Kim. So as I mentioned, that includes our polling section. I'm going to cover some resources for both NIBRS and NCVS, and then we'll answer some of your questions that have come through the Q&A during this presentation. As we've said before, we want you to take away from this presentation that while NCVS and NIBRS are different, in terms of methodology or some of the topics that we cover, neither is right or wrong, and both are doing great things for helping to address the state of crime in the United States. They're not competitors, they complement each other and together provide a more complete picture of crime. And they can be used to answer different questions. As we just saw, one data set might be more appropriate for a certain question than the other one, or sometimes you can use both, or one or the other. It just depends on what you're looking into and what each data set covers. So Kim went over this. I'll just briefly summarize again some of the NIBRS, like how you can access NIBRS data and statistics. There's obviously BGS statistical reports featured on BGS's website. There's the LearCat tool, which we saw some screenshots of earlier, and some great tables. There's also the public use files through NACJD. There's the FBI Crime Data Explorer, or CDE, on the FBI's website. And there's also the FBI API. And if you have any questions about those, Kim can help answer those. This is a screenshot of the Crime Data Explorer, where you can download estimation tables, unweighted data files, national estimates, and also there are documents on weighting and imputation, interpreting confidence intervals, population estimates, and the indicators produced by NIBRS. There's a new suite of estimates coming for 2023, including expanded set of firearm-related incidents, and carjacking will be included again, which sounds very great and interesting. Here's a screenshot from NACJD, where you can download those public use data files, and some more links to LearCat, and then the extract files is the NACJD files. For NCVS, you can also access NCVS data or estimates through BGS statistical reports. So we heard about the LearCat. There's also the N-Dash, or NCVS dashboard online data tool. That has a subset of NCVS variables where you can look at cross sections of, victim age and victim sex and incident characteristics like reporting to police. There are different ways you can look at the NCVS data that might be easier than downloading the data files. We also have our public use data files available on NACJD. The public use data files cover almost all of the NCVS survey. The main reason that you would access the restricted files is to get that lower level subnational data. And as I mentioned before, you have to apply through research.data.gov to get access to those restricted data. We also have an API. Similarly, it's a subset of variables, but some of the variables have been recoded to help ease our data users' experience. So just different options for both of these data collections depending on your needs and wants. We also have a number of NCVS resources, since we know it can be a little confusing or sometimes hard to grasp at the beginning, but we've got some resource guides, code books, technical documentation. We also have users' guides for calculating standard errors, since we are a household-based sample survey, both through generalized variance functions and direct variance estimation. NACJD has a learning guide available for NCVS. And then if you're going to be at ASC, or the American Society of Criminology Conference in San Francisco in 2024, we do a whole NCVS workshop where we go even deeper compared to what is in this presentation if you want to learn more about the NCVS. If you want to stay up to date with BJS, you can subscribe to Just Stats, or also follow BJS on X and Facebook. And then we have an email account, the askbjs@usdoj.gov. You can definitely email that email address with questions, and it'll be forwarded to the appropriate person who can help answer your question. These are also our emails. Thank you again for coming to this webinar. We hope it was really informative. You can contact either the Ask BJS email or any of us about questions that we're not able to answer during this webinar. And I think we're now going to go to Q&A, which I guess that's right. I'm running Q&A. Sorry. We got a lot of questions in the chat and the Q&A. We're not going to be able to get to all of them most likely, but we're going to try to get as far as we can. There are a couple that came in for NIBRS, there are a couple that came in for NCVS, and some can be answered by both persons. So we're going to kind of jump around between each data collection. But we'll start with a question for Kim on NIBRS. Are there any measures to check the correctness of the data entered? If departments are not used to enter information in this much detail with older systems, are there any trainings or incentives in place to enable them to enter all of this information correctly and completely?
That is an excellent question. Yes. So the way that NIBRS works, it is a big shift transitioning, but the software, it becomes more automated. So when agencies go through the process of getting NIBRS certified, they have to purchase a records management system to store all this data that is NIBRS compliant, meaning it has to, and actually this kind of covers multiple questions that we got about this. Great questions. So the system is going to ingest all of the NIBRS crime types. It's going to be set up. There will be like a mobile incident form for officers to fill in. And as soon as you select, let's say, a particular victim or a crime type, it's going to walk you through certain prompts and data elements that you have to collect for NIBRS for that particular type of Group A offense. So it is more automated. That helps. It doesn't ameliorate all chances of making mistakes. There are issues where, maybe an officer quickly enters unknown and then intends to go back to it to fill in information. But there are lots of trainings that go into this. There's trainings given by each state program because the states themselves certify their local agencies to be NIBRS compliant. And so the states are doing it, but the FBI their trainings are really detailed, and they go all over the country doing these trainings. I actually have their training materials. It walks you through all the required data elements for each crime. And it's kind of a train the trainer model. So the FBI might be training folks at each agency who are responsible for then training all of the officers. And this can be a big lift, you know. So an agency like one of my grantees I had once was Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. You know, that means training 4,000 officers, you know. It's like 10,000 if you're, you know, NYPD. And so it is a very strict, it's a very structured process. And before an agency gets certified, they have to actually sort of do a dry, you know, a real run through of this, where officers have to collect this incident-based data and it gets submitted, and, you know, they have to correct errors. They have to find any sort of discrepancies. You know, they go through all of this as part of the certification process. So there is substantial training. Even after they're certified, there's always continued training. So the answer is yes. And they have systems in place, automation systems and records management systems that walk them through. Now, this varies depending on the service provider that creates your records management system. Okay, I do want to stress that. Those products do vary substantially, but for the most part, you're going to have a system, an application. Think of it as an app on your phone, where you can pull up, enter the crime, and it's going to walk you through all the incident, victim, offender characteristics that you need to enter for that. And they will continuously train you on that. And I still learn things from the trainings from the FBI, to be honest. They're very detailed. They're excellent. So yes.
Thanks, Kim. I'm going to switch to a question for Susanna on the NCVS. How do you arrive at the percentage balance of non-reported crimes? In other words, how do you measure non-reported crimes?
So that's a great question. As part of the crime incident report, one of the questions asked is, was this incident reported to police? And then they asked who reported it, and also if the person reported it, they're asked why they chose to report it. And if they don't report it, they're asked why they didn't choose to report it. So we actually can look at that, and then we just compare the number of people who say they did report to police and the number who didn't, and that's how we come up with that estimate.
Awesome, thank you. There's a question I think that was asked during the NIBRS section, but both can be answered by both NCVS and NIBRS. The question is, what info is there on location of criminal incidents? Is it address, census tract, or what? I can answer for the NCVS, and I'll pass it to Kim to answer for NIBRS. So for location in the NCVS, there's two things to keep in mind. There's the household location, and then there's the location of the crime. So when you access the restricted data, you're really getting more granular location on the household location. And because it's through the Census Bureau, you have, you know, state, county, MSA. I think it does go down to the census tract. But that, to be clear, that is the location of the household. In terms of getting the location of the crime, there are response categories that we collect in terms of the location of the crime. So it could be the victim's house, it could be on a street, it could be in a restaurant, it could be at school. If you look at the crime incident report, there's like, I forget how many, but there's a lot of different categories that usually for reports we have to roll up into broader categories. So there's not quite the same, you can't get like the census tract for the location of the crime, but you can get kind of an approximate, okay, where did this crime occur, or what type of place did this crime occur for the NCVS. And that location data of, you know, school or building or office, higher level categories of that question are available on the NDASH, which you can take a look at on our website under data tools. And then I'll pass it to Kim to answer for NIBRS.
That is a terrific question. So to sort of bifurcate it the way the way Lexi answered, in NIBRS, the closest you can get in terms of where that crime happened is the agency that reported it. So you can get to the city or the county or the state. Law enforcement frequently have lat long data or the specific address where incidents, or as specific as they can get, an address of where incidents occur. That is not part of NIBRS. So we do not have that information. That is something, so to adopt that would be something that the FBI would undertake. They have a process where any changes that are recommended, discussed, voted on, go through the what's called the Advisory Policy Board, the APB. And that's a multi-year process. So I'm sure the potential is out there. Since so many agencies do collect that information, it is not part of NIBRS. If that was included as part of NIBRS, there would obviously have to be discussions about suppressing, some of that information and, in order to not reveal PII, to maintain privacy. So that is the extent of what we know about incident, the actual geographic location of where each incident occurs. NIBRS does measure a wide variety of location types for each incident that is recorded, and it is required for every incident. There are over 50 different location types. So when we use them in reports, you'll typically see them rolled up into much broader categories. It gets as specific as like parking lots, parks, buildings, government buildings. I mean, it is very, very specific. And I'm trying to think, we even have, I think, flags for if it occurred in certain institutions. I know jails and prisons is one. But yeah, so there's a lot of different types of location. You can record more than one location type. It can get a little bit, complicated with so many different options. And the way the trainers, train you to use location type is to use the one that is most specific. So for example, if you are at, for example, one of the newer changes to location type is we used to have a location type of school that lumped in together primary schools, daycares, and universities. Now those are separated so that there's greater specificity. And so you're just supposed to pick the one that's most specific. So if it is a convenience store, like, I don't know, let's say there's a robbery at a 7-Eleven or a Quick Trip if you're in Georgia, or a Sheetz if you're in Virginia, you would want to actually select like gas station or convenience store as opposed to like retail, a retail store. So it can get pretty specific, and that's mostly where location information comes from for NIBRS.
Thank you, Kim. Since we're nearing the end of the webinar, I'm going to do one more question that can be addressed by both NCVS and NIBRS. But if we don't answer your question, definitely email us or the Ask BJS email, and then we can get a response to you for your specific question. So the question is, recently the statistician of the U.S. has revealed in the Federal Registrar federal data collection efforts regarding race and ethnicity will be expanded and improved. How will BJS account for these necessary changes to include more precise race ethnicity data in NIBRS/NCVS under victimization, among victimization experiences? We'll go to Susanna and then Kim to answer that, and then we'll conclude the webinar.
Thanks, Lexi. That's a great question. One of the good things about the NCVS is it's administered by census, and they have a lot of really great capabilities. But one of the disadvantages is it's administered by census, and it's really hard to make those kind of changes. So basically, census will be bound to comply to some new standards, and then that will affect the NCVS. But until they decide to make those changes, they won't be reflected on the NCVS, unfortunately.
Yeah, and just to add for context, the last time the race and ethnicity standards changed were in 1997, and they were incorporated into the NCVS in 2003. So it took about 6 years. We're still working out a timeline with our census counterparts, but yeah, we will definitely eventually be including that in the NCVS data collection.
With respect to NIBRS, I actually cannot really speak to that issue. Because the FBI manages and administers NIBRS in concert with their data providers, they do have an advisory policy board. The data is shared because it's provided by state and local agencies. That is an issue they will have to take up. And I know that they have several years to adopt it and implement it. That is just something I'll have to punt to the FBI. That is a decision that they're going to make in terms of the process, how long it will take. At this time, there are standards for collecting race and ethnicity data that are not incorporated into NIBRS. So yeah, to be determined. I might have to reach out to our FBI counterparts to try to get an answer to that. My understanding is that they are aware of that change, and obviously they're probably in the planning stages now. But yeah, I would have to get back to you. I'm happy to reach out to the FBI and try to find out some more information for you.
Thanks, Kim, and thank you, Susanna, and everyone who attended this webinar. We appreciate all your questions and hope you came away having learned a lot and have some more ideas brewing in terms of how you can learn about crime. So thank you again. And yeah, shoot us an email or ask BJS if you have any questions. And thank you and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Great. So on behalf of the Bureau of Justice Statistics and our panelists, we want to thank you for joining today's webinar. This will end today's presentation.